Welcome to Meaningful Work Matters. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, and today I'm joined by Zach Mercurio from Colorado State University, an expert pracademic in the psychology of mattering at work. In this episode, we explore the powerful concept of mattering, what it means to feel seen, valued, and relied upon, and how that drives human behavior and engagement in the workplace. Zach explains that mattering isn't just a nice to have, it's a fundamental psychological need. We talk about the significance of moments when someone acknowledges your importance and how these moments can boost self-esteem, well-being, and productivity. On the flip side, we delve into the concept of anti-mattering when people feel invisible or insignificant at work and how that leads to disengagement and potentially disruptive behaviors. Whether you're a leader looking to strengthen your team's morale or someone seeking to understand your own significance at work, this episode offers invaluable insights and stories that illustrate what it means to matter and why it's so essential for creating meaningful work. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Zach Mercurio, it is a pleasure to be able to have you on this episode of Meaningful Work Matters. Welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to get into this conversation. I think that we're going to be diving into the depths of mattering today. But before we get there, why don't you just introduce yourself? Tell us what makes your work meaningful.
Yeah, I spend about 30% of my time doing research on the experience of meaningfulness in work and mattering in work and the Center for Meaning and Purpose at Colorado State University in the Department of Psychology. And then the rest of my time is I'm out with leaders, really testing these ideas and testing the research and then refining it, to meet leaders, especially where they're at, in all sorts of different organizations. And what makes my work meaningful is when I get to see a moment of mattering happen for someone else. One of my first studies was with a group of university janitors. And we were trying to understand over the course of a year and a half what made work meaningful in a very difficult, often overlooked profession. I recall we were observing in a break room and a student had walked by and they threw a piece of trash and it hit the floor and the student kept walking. That type of raking occupation. And what was remarkable to me was that it was not the big moment. It wasn't the big barbecue or a free meal or a certificate or an award. It was the tiniest of moments where somebody looked someone in the eye, a custodian in the eye, and said, I just want to thank you for being here. It was these tiny moments when I remember a supervisor shared with a custodian the definition of the word custodian in a dictionary. He pulled out a dictionary for this custodian who has struggled and said, a custodian is a person responsible for a building and everyone in it. And she said that it was that moment that, kept her there for 30 years. And so for me, those moments of mattering are so tiny and they occur in our everyday interactions that when I hear about them, when I see them happening, when I experience them for myself, that's what really makes my work meaningful. I see my purpose as helping people to realize their own significance. And one of the ways we realize our significance is by seeing the evidence of our significance around us through these moments of mattering.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Zach. It's wonderful to be able to have a pracademic on this call. Somebody who not only knows the research, is doing the research, but is actually out in the world trying to figure out how to apply it in the messy world of reality, and bringing those moments that truly matter to life in the way that you just did is exquisite. So thank you for bringing storytelling already to this episode.
It's hard not to. right? Because I'm initially a qualitative researcher who does quantitative research as well. That's how I describe myself. But that lived experience, I mean, when you really, I'll invite everybody as you go into listening to the rest of today, I'll invite you to think about the first moment in your life when someone made you feel like you mattered as a human being
Hmm.
and bring that moment to mind. And what does that feel like? I mean, that's really what we're talking about today.
Well, let's use that right away. Let's jump in. What is mattering? What's mattering? Why do you think it's so important?
Well, mattering is the belief that we're significant to people around us. And, Isaac Prilatensky, a psychologist whose work I draw on a lot, describes mattering as coming from two primary sources: feeling valued by the people around us, and then adding value to the people around us. But to take it a little bit deeper, mattering is an instinct. It's a survival instinct. The first thing I remember when my first son was born, when they put him down in the bassinet at the hospital, is I looked down and I reached down to him. And I remember him reaching his hand back up and he grasped my index finger really tightly, really inordinately tightly for like how tiny he was. And scientists call this our grasp reflex. And it's one of several reflexes that from the minute we're born, we tilt our head upward, we reach our tiny hands out. Everybody listening did this. And we search to matter to someone enough to keep us alive. The first thing you did as a human being was you searched to matter to another human being. You would not be listening to this podcast if at some point in your life you did not procure mattering to another person enough to keep you alive. So it is a survival instinct. And then, as most survival instincts do, it evolves into a psychological need. The psychological need to feel cared for, to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, and to be needed by others. And that's why it's such a prerequisite for human action. It's very difficult for anything to matter to someone who doesn't first believe that they matter. And that's why it can be so disorienting when we don't see how we matter. Think about a newborn who reaches out for a caretaker and the absolute frantic energy and the panic of not finding someone.
Mm.
That is the consequence of not having the instinct to matter met. For adults as well, we either act out in withdrawal or act out in desperation.
I'm actually really interested in pursuing this anti-mattering, as you've called it. Possibly you're stealing that from
Well,
somebody else as well.
Gordon
Yes,
Flett, Gordon Flett,
Gordon Flett.
psychologist at
Yeah.
York University. He has an
Yeah.
anti-mattering scale, and the word anti-mattering, he pays homage to Paul Dirac, the physicist, that calls antimatter, the opposite of
Mm.
matter, the dark energy. And he says it
Mm.
has a just as powerful as the powerful charge matter has, the same inverse powerful charge the experience of antimattering has for human beings.
Mhm. Mhm. I mean, I think it's so important for us to think about that in that way, not least of which just because talking about psychological needs. I mean, just the negativity bias that we all have makes the anti-mattering feel so much more important than ultimately those moments of mattering are, even though the reverse is probably true. The anti-mattering probably stands out in our minds. It's probably easier to find and think about times in our lives when we have not felt like we mattered than times when we have.
Yeah, sometimes when I ask people to describe the moment, and we're doing an interview research study right now, we describe
Mm.
the first moment in your life when you felt like you mattered as a human being.
Yeah.
And who was it that helped you feel like that? A lot of times people will go towards, they say, well, I can't think of one, but I can think of the moment I felt like I didn't matter.
Didn't matter. Right. Right. Yeah.
Which is interesting, right? Because the experiences of mattering tend to actually create the self beliefs. There's two self
Mm.
beliefs that follow experiences of mattering. And I think this is important: self esteem, which is the belief that we're worthy, and self efficacy, which is the belief that we're capable. In
Mm.
workplaces, self esteem and self efficacy are the most powerful predictors of things like performance and productivity and all those outcomes we say we want.
Mhm.
But one of the misnomers we have about things like self-esteem and self-efficacy is we think we can go get them ourselves.
Mm.
Like I
Say
can
more about
go
that. Yeah.
like I can go sit in my office and believe that I'm worthy, right? If
Mm.
even if I go into an environment where I get evidence of the opposite.
Mm.
And a well individual in an unwell system eventually becomes an unwell individual. And that's why
Hmm.
mattering is so unique because it's a systemic concept. It's a
Hmm.
it's a it's really born out of community psychology. It's a community concept, meaning that one of the most primitive instincts and needs we have is also one that's most reliant on others
Hmm.
to show
Hmm.
us that evidence. So that idea of interpersonal mattering, but as you said, yeah, the experience of anti-mattering, right? Those moments are pervasive as well because when we're talking to people about what anti-mattering feels like, they typically describe two things, and they describe acting out in withdrawal because of anti-mattering or acting out in desperation.
Hmm.
Two acts typically follow when we feel insignificant. Like acts of withdrawal, like isolating, withholding, or leaving an organization or leaving in a relationship, or acting out in desperation. Hey, I matter more than you think. Complaining, blaming, gossiping. Like gossip in the workplace, for example, is predicted by psychological contract violation, so lack of fair treatment and respect, or psychological abuse by a supervisor. So if I don't matter to someone else, I'm going to find somebody who will listen to me. So these reactions are also very strong when we experience not mattering.
I want to pick on that second perspective on acting out in a second, but before we do, let's talk about the disengagement side of things, or possibly as one person has called it, calibrated contribution. But you talked about, you wrote a blog kind of in the waning days of the pandemic about how, and I'll kind of quote, upheaval events like COVID amplify people's search for meaning, and we're seeing a grasp for significance and demand for dignity in work. And you were very
Mm,
much kind of, I think, arguing about the erosion of meaningful work, or possibly one of the consequences of this anti-mattering, and that maybe that might be one of the reasons why there was this whole phenomenon of quiet quitting, where people were just disengaging with work. They weren't leaving their jobs, but they were trying to do as little as they possibly could. And and I certainly thought the same thing. I mean, when Cal Riff and I kind of wrote our paper in 2023, we were very much looking at those experiences, first of the Great Resignation and then of quiet quitting, and asking ourselves, hey, is this maybe a kind of symbol of the ways in which meaningful work either doesn't exist or is being manipulated, specifically at that systemic level? And just to kind of pile on a little bit about that, because I don't actually hear many people talk about quiet quitting anymore, certainly not nearly as much as they were a couple of years ago. But there are certainly a lot of upheaval events that
mm.
continue to be adding to our plate. And whether it's climate change, whether it's war, whether it's politics, we're getting pummeled in every single direction with a lot of upheaval events. So tell me more about kind of this argument that you have around the relationship between kind of mattering, anti-mattering, and some of that.
Yeah, the COVID pandemic, and I'm sure you've talked about that plenty on the podcast. We won't dive deep into that again, but the COVID pandemic, one of my friends remarked to me that it felt apocalyptic.
Hmm.
And I like the word apocalypse because the Greek root is apocalypsis, which means to reveal. So
Hmm.
I don't think the pandemic, for example, necessarily introduced the need for meaningful work or for mattering, but it revealed it for many people. And what was gained? Well, time to reflect. There's some studies in Britain that people more than ever reflected more on the quality of their jobs and of their lives, right? That time to reflect. We also had a spike in what the philosopher Roman Krznaric calls death nudges.
Hmm.
A death nudge is when we have an acute awareness of our mortality. Now, research shows that when we think about our mortality, we actually become more interested in how our lives matter. We become more interested in our legacy. In fact, there's some research that shows that if you had two groups and one group, you had them read a story about a humorous situation and then had them allocate money to a charity. And then you had another group read a story about a plane crash, for example, and had them allocate money for the charity. It's been replicated that the group that will hear and be reminded of their mortality will actually donate more money.
Hmm. Hmm.
So society in a very concentrated inescapable way had a collective death nudge, right? That this is like, so why me? Why here? Why now? And then on the same train, you have governments telling people they're essential, basically using the language of mattering, which is feeling relied on, needed, telling people that they're needed. So when you tell people that they're needed, they inevitably go and say, "Hey, do I feel needed?" And then you have rising calls for social justice, rightfully so, hitting the mainstream conversation. So all of these things conspired in a very interesting way at the right time to create this potential meaning deficit that people were saying, why me? Why here? Why now? Now, for workplaces, all of this was happening in an environment of infinitely increasing choice. And this is the variable that I think makes meaningful work and the experience of mattering in work, which is a contributor to meaningful work, inescapable now, is that people have more choices of where, when, and how to earn a living. Educational attainment is up, literacy rates are up, people have more access to gig work. If I feel disrespected by you, I can go drive an Uber and piece together as much money as I was making from you, but I don't have to deal with your disrespect anymore. And that's going to be infinitely increasing. So when people have more choice or volition, as psychologists call this, they have more discernment, and people tend to discern where they want to spend their time based on how they feel.
Hmm.
And so that is why I think we're in this inescapable place where the experience of meaningfulness in work, the experience of dignity, of experiencing your work and yourself as positive and purposeful, and the place where you spend a third of your life is an inescapable reality.
Hmm.
And how mattering fits in is, well, you can't really see your work as significant unless you feel significant.
I want to go into mattering in a second and do a deeper dive into what that
What do
actually
you what do
means,
you
what
what
that
do you think?
significance.
Yeah, what do you think?
But
So
I
that's
but I
my
think,
take on
yeah,
what's going on from a macro
I
perspective.
I really like I really like this notion that of the death nudge. The death nudge, the death nudge coupled with choice is a really fascinating provocation. Just because I think that death nudges, what they do is they open up the world of existential possibilities for us, right? Like they are the fundamental why, right? If I'm thinking about my life and specifically the end of my life, it raises the perspective of why I'm here to begin with, what I want to hope to be able to accomplish. I mean, this is where eudaimonia comes from as a
Ah,
concept. I
yeah.
mean, this is something that Aristotle probably would have very much agreed with, that it is very much about looking backwards. What would a life well lived be? What would make that life worthwhile, significant? All the things that we're probably going to be talking about would make that life matter at the end of the day. And so this idea of the why, coupled with a whole bunch of other choices around autonomy, around what I do, when I do it, where I do it, how I work, is, I think, a massive gift in some ways that the pandemic gave. And I think that the interesting thing is that as some of that autonomy has been taken away over the last couple of years, because I'm really curious that these connotations of things like quiet quitting are not as prevalent as they were. They probably continue to exist, but people are certainly talking about them a lot less. But as the essential worker no longer became essential, I feel like we have moved to a certain extent from acts of withdrawal, as you talked of them, towards acts of, I guess, desperation or potentially acts of activism. And I think that there's great power also in that death nudge plus choice of really going towards collective activism, going towards collective action, trying to say, hey, how can we try to change the system to ultimately benefit us in some way, shape, or form? I mean, it's what Todd Kashdan on this podcast has called kind of the art of insubordination or principled rebellion. And so I guess I ask about the possibilities for activism in this space and whether that might actually be really good for society.
In August of 2023, more workers went on strike than at any given point in the 21st century.
Beautiful stat. Great.
Uh,
Amazing. Wow.
and and that is a culmination of,
Mm,
and Martin Luther King said that protest is the language of the unheard.
Mm.
And but what I think a lot of this is mattering in disguise, right? The language of the
Exactly.
unheard, of feeling unseen, of feeling
Invisibility.
unvalued,
Yeah.
invisibility, and being desperate to be seen, being desperate to be known, being desperate to be valued
Mm.
occurs in these macro ways like activism, but in very micro ways in organizations as well. A lot of people who talk about toxic behaviors in organizations, for example, are saying, well, what's wrong with this person? I'm pushing people to start asking, what's wrong with the environment?
With right with the person
Yeah,
that
what's
is
right with
create.
the person? What's wrong with the environment? What
That's right.
Because many in my practice, and I have the luxury, right, of seeing this from the outside when I work with an organization,
Hmm.
but many times in my practice, I find the most quote unquote difficult employees are usually the most unseen, unheard, and undervalued employees. A lot of people talk about what at the end of a keynote, someone came up to me and says, "Hey, Zach, what do I do with the office Eeyores? Eeyore, the sad donkey from Winnie the Pooh." And I said, "Well, what do you currently do with the office Eeyores?" Now, everybody was crowding around me as if I was about to impart some like answer. And she said, it's those people that are always complaining and always give the same feedback. And I said, "What do you do currently do?" And people start saying, "Well, we don't CC them on emails, or we try not to invite them to meetings because they're disruptive." Now, what is the opposite psychological thing that someone who's acting out probably needs? It's to have attention withdrawn from them, right? You see this in schools. I mean, classic psychological studies of children on bullying behavior. Those things are usually acts to get the attention that they're not getting in family life and in other areas of their lives, right? What is that? It's matter. It's anti-mattering. So I don't think there are many more people who don't feel like they matter than there are difficult people.
Mhm. It makes me think about the Tao of Pooh. I want to go back and
Uh-huh.
reread the Tao of Pooh and think about what was it? What did they say about Eeyore? This pessimistic, gloomy
Yeah, right,
outlook on
right,
life. But at the same
right.
time, the focus on the wrong absolutely can kind of lead to the possibility of solutions. And
Or the attribution error
that's
that
right.
your behavior is your problem. Like
Yeah.
if you come into a room and you don't ever give feedback, like I hear this all the time from leaders as an example, that person never speaks up or never gives feedback, even though we ask for it. Well,
Mhm.
someone will not share their voice if they don't first believe their voice is significant to you.
Mhm.
So if you don't do the relational groundwork to ensure that someone believes and sees that their voice is significant, you can't expect them to share that with you, right? Or we did the strengths assessment and nobody's using it. Well, for people to use their strengths, they first have to believe they have strengths, right?
Mhm.
Purpose, another one, purpose, contribution. If you want somebody to contribute or to have a direction to their life, they first have to believe their life is worthy of
Mhm.
contribution and they're worthy of direction, right? If you want someone to care about anything, they first have to believe that they're cared for. And so I do
Uh,
think a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of things that are termed difficult employees or we have turnover issues are actually the language of the unseen, unheard, making themselves heard and seen.
So how do you make someone heard and seen? You talk about three major things. One, feeling noticed, two, feeling affirmed, and three, feeling needed. Can you take each one of us? Can you take us through each one of those and maybe kind of give some examples of
Yeah,
what that
yeah.
could look like?
So psychologist Gregory Elliott, he did a great summary of the key components of feeling like we matter, right? Awareness or attention, having people pay attention to us. Importance, feeling important to other people, feeling like we have something important to offer, and then reliance, feeling that other people need us. What was missing from that is that we've understood for a very long time what mattering feels like and what constitutes its experience. But what was missing is what people actually do to create those experiences. So one of the things that we have been doing over the last 5 years is really asking people, when people help you feel like you matter, what are they doing? And there are three things that have come out of that work. One is feeling noticed. So feeling noticed is feeling seen and heard. Now, noticing someone is a lot different than knowing them. I can know you, Andrew, but not notice that you're suffering. I can know you very well, but not notice that you came back from a trip and that you're tired, right?
See the bags
Note,
under my eyes.
yeah, right. Well,
Yeah.
that would require noticing. So noticing is the deliberate act of paying attention to the ebbs and flows of people's lives and
Mm,
offering an action to
mm,
show them that you're paying attention. One of my favorite practices around noticing was a leader that I worked with in a distribution center. Now, all these teams scored very low on these engagement surveys, except for this one team. And I went to this team and I said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And all of them said some version of it's our leader. She just gets us. We'd do anything for her. They were effusive in their love for her. And I asked her, I said, "What do you do?" And she pulls out this old notebook. She had this moleskin notebook. She says, "I write down my team members' names on Friday morning at the beginning of the day. And I write down one thing I heard them complain about,
mm,
talk about that week, personal issue they were dealing with. They were going on vacation." And she goes, "Just to remind myself to check in on them, I read that notebook, that page on Monday as I start my week. And I remember to check in on them and I say, hey, I remember you talked about this last week. I wanted to check in on that." Right. And this was brilliant and just a brilliant, sophisticated practice because
right.
it actually connects to the research that shows that this tool of noting is a key way we can relearn how to pay attention to one another.
Hmm.
That's an example of noticing.
Beautiful.
The second is affirming people, showing people how their unique gifts make a unique difference. There's a very big difference between appreciation, recognition, and affirmation, however, and this is often misconstrued by leaders. Appreciation is showing gratitude for who someone is. Like I can appreciate you, Andrew, and being here and your podcast and your work. Recognition is showing gratitude for what someone does. I can elevate your work. Gosh, look at all the effort you did in preparing for this conversation. But affirmation is showing someone the specific evidence of their specific significance. So I could say, hey, Andrew, when we were having that conversation earlier, you paused. I could tell you were really listening. And then you were very intentional in bringing back the death nudge as something that was interested to you. And I could see you were really curious. And I
Hmm.
want you to know that that really sparked some new thoughts for me.
I
Right.
feel so good. Thanks,
Yeah,
Zach.
right. That is specific affirmation, right?
Yeah.
And it's an interpersonal skill. You can't do affirmation in an employee appreciation program through perks or awards. It's interpersonal.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
And then the final is feeling needed. It's feeling essential. When people feel replaceable, they tend to act replaceable. In 1913, Max Ringelmann, French agricultural engineer, famous experiment, had individuals pull on a rope as hard as they could. They attached the rope to a dynameter that measures force, and then they had groups pull on the rope as hard as they could. And who do you think exhibited the most total force when he added up the readings? It was the individuals. And why? Because they knew that they and their efforts were indispensable.
Mm,
And so when we feel irreplaceable, we act irreplaceable. So feeling needed. And some of the people we talk with say that the most powerful thing their leaders do to help them feel needed is say 5 words. If it wasn't for you, if it wasn't for you, this wouldn't be possible. And they use that language often. So noticed, affirmed, and needed.
mm,
And some of my Australian friends say it reminds them of Nan, which is a grandmother figure, or when we're coding computer data, it means not a number. So it can help you
mm.
remember that. Am I making sure people in the next interaction I have feel noticed, affirmed, and needed?
That's a bit of a mic drop. Not a number. That's a great way of being able to frame it. And grandmother. I feel like that works too. There's so much of this podcast that is dedicated to trying to spell out the complexities of meaningful work in all sorts of different contexts and the sunny sides, the dark sides, the good, the bad, the
Yeah.
ugly of the whole entire thing. But I think that the ways in which you point to the simplicity of what kind of leadership behaviors are actually required for making someone feel not like a number. It's, as you say, maddeningly simple. Check in with people, show empathy, be compassionate, you say. You have in another one of your blog posts, you talk about the fact that this is like really just restoring elementary school morality. And why is it so hard for leaders to try to figure this out?
So just to give you an example, I got to work with this group that one of their jobs is to set up grocery store shelves overnight to redisplay products. It's one of the largest merchandising companies in the world. And I got asked to go speak about culture at their leadership conference. And I got to have lunch with some of the executives. And I asked them, I said, hey, tell me about the processes and procedures you have to make sure the right product gets on the right shelves, displayed in the right ways. And they had like all of this flow charts. And I mean, I didn't even understand what they were talking about, but it was so complex and so regimented. And then I said, oh, tell me about now, can you tell me about the processes you have to make sure that people feel seen, heard, valued, and needed? It's collective silence. And then what happened is that they said, oh, well, we have this module that all of our supervisors go through online on effective supervision. And then we try to hire the right people. The problem is that for so long, when it comes to leadership development and when it comes to the things that matter most in human beings' lives, we've relied on intuition. Intuition does not scale in an organization, in communities, practices and skills scale. We tend to have practices, skills, processes, flow charts, checklists for everything else that matters in an organization, except ensuring the people how they matter, ensuring the people know how they matter. And so I think one of the big problems is that we've relied on intuition for so long for the soft stuff.
Mm.
Now, you probably have heard of the overconfidence bias. So when someone tells us something is simple, we tend to think we're experts at it. So if someone tells you, "Oh, it's pretty simple to do that," we tend to approach it with less rigor. So
Hmm.
one of the biggest disservices we've done is called these essential things soft skills.
Soft skills. That's right.
But one of the things that's not talked about is the psychological ramifications of that, which
Hmm.
is a collective overconfidence bias. For example, there's been studies that show that leaders rate themselves as excellent listeners, but their followers often rate themselves as very poor rate their leaders as very poor listeners. This is replicated time and time again, right? This gap. And why is that? I think it's the overconfidence bias.
Mm.
So I think the problem is common sense is not common practice. And we need to get back to reteaching the essential basic skills of
Which, for the
seeing,
record, nobody
hearing,
ever actually.
valuing.
I
No,
mean, those are skills that no one ever teaches. You don't go to an
no. And
MBA program on
sadly,
how to listen.
you
Like it just
know,
doesn't happen.
right? And sadly, there's another element here, which is that the rise of digital technology, we actually don't have to use those skills anymore as much.
Mm,
So if you tell me that you had a bad day, I can just say, "Oh, sorry to hear that" in a text. I don't have to hone the skills of sitting with you
mm,
and saying, "Hey, tell me more about that.
mm,
What's
mm,
going on?" I don't have to sit with the discomfort of being in a conversation. So one of the things that's happening is as we haven't used those skills as humans, something sneaky is happening where we are starting to lose our proficiency at them
mm,
in a time where we need them most, right? And that's why I think one result is hearing that 30% of workers feel invisible,
mhm,
65% of people feel underappreciated. 58% of people feel lonely, for example. Recent meta analysis on what constitutes loneliness is very clear. It's not having more people around you. That's the cure for loneliness. It's feeling significant to the people around you, having
mhm.
quality relationships. So I think we're seeing right now this collective uncovering, this revelation that we need to relearn how to see, hear, value, and understand the person across from us.
One of the things that just as you
Yeah.
say that makes me wonder is I'll bet that AI is actually pretty good at noticing, affirming, and showing someone how they're needed. Do you have
Yeah,
any
interesting. Yeah, there's
thoughts?
not no, there needs
Do
to
you have
be
any
more
thoughts
research
on
on it.
like
Yeah, I'd like
on what the difference is
yeah.
between like because I could imagine a bot who's just trained to take a look at what your productivity is over the course of the week and tell you all the
Yeah.
ways in which, you have been noticed, affirmed, and needed based on the work that you're doing. Probably way better than a manager ever could. Do you think that that would actually help someone?
Yeah, so right now, I think in that sense of like monitoring and
Mm-hmm.
feeding back,
Mm-hmm.
I think could work. I mean, AI is a transactional medium.
That's it.
Right now, it's a question and response medium.
Yep.
So we prompt it and it responds, right? The problem with that is it's transactional and AI cannot seek to understand the meaning behind your words. what Carl Rogers calls listening for total meaning,
Hmm.
right? It can't seek to mine out and understand your lived experience yet. It can't offer an act of rational compassion yet. It can give you a
Yet.
menu of items,
Yeah.
right? It can give
Yes.
you a menu of items,
Yeah.
but it also can't it can't look you in the eye, and it can't give you the neurochemical boost that happens when we make close contact with one another,
Hmm.
that helps you feel more at ease in the form of oxytocin. It can't quite do that yet. But I'd be interested to see what the affective responses of humans to AI doing some of these mattering skills to humans doing the same ones, and see if they're
Hmm.
different. That's a great experiment. So we should
Yeah.
set that up.
Especially in a virtual context, where I'm not necessarily able to be face to face with my employees anyway,
Yeah.
you know. We're talking so much about the role of the leader, and I think leadership is really important. I think it's probably the most important driver of mattering that we can possibly have in an organization. And as you said before, mattering is a systems problem. Mattering is absolutely something that we need to try to tackle holistically. And you've talked about policies and practices and operationalizing mattering in different kinds of ways. And so I'm really curious when you think about actually how you would design an organization to make people feel like they matter beyond just that leadership role. What would you do? How would you actually enable a culture of mattering in an organization? What are some of the greatest hits that you might have seen?
It's a great question because environment does two things. I mean, it either makes behavior possible or it determines it will occur.
Hmm.
The best organizations that I've seen do this, they make the behaviors of showing others how they matter possible first. So, for example, if you're in a distribution center and you want to start creating mattering, but your managers are scheduled down to the minute and there's a GPS device tracking how productive they are, your environment doesn't make it possible for someone to check in on somebody.
Hmm.
It doesn't make it possible to ask a meaningful question to somebody. You as an individual, if your calendar is so full that and back-to-back meetings and someone at the end of a meeting brings up a really hard thing they're going through and you have a next meeting and you don't have the time to say, hey, I want to hear more about that, then you don't have the time. Your environment doesn't make it possible for you to be compassionate. So one of the best conversations that I've seen organizations have is what's happening in our environment that makes the behaviors we say we want impossible. What could we do to make those behaviors possible?
Hmm.
The second is environment determines whether the behavior will occur. For example, if let's just say I was moving to a new neighborhood and the neighborhood had a pool, the environment would make it possible that I would swim, right? But let's imagine I'm moving to a neighborhood and the neighborhood has a pool and I'm required to pass a swimming test to live there. The environment determines that swimming will occur, right? Organizations that determine mattering behaviors occur, create systems in which the behavior to see, hear, value one another is developed and evaluated.
Hmm.
And so one of the companies that I worked with, and they gave me permission to share their story, is American Express Global Business Travel. They have thousands of people, of agents on the front line, often working in remote settings, taking care of people's business travel needs. Now, after the pandemic, Mark, who was the chief operating officer at the time, noticed a significant drop in morale of people feeling overlooked. And he had this moment where he said, people don't feel like they matter here anymore. And he could just feel it. And so what he did was he invested in getting all 700 leaders on 5 continents together and virtually. And we spent hours explaining what mattering is, what it felt like. And then we had the leaders in small groups come up with behaviors that they would do in their organizations that they would commit to making sure people felt noticed, affirmed, and needed. They came up with the behaviors that fit in their context. Keeping your camera on, making sure you follow up and check in on when you hear someone struggling and offering an action to help, those types of things. And then we created templates for ideas under each of those behaviors that leaders could do. But then what the organization did is they stopped measuring employee engagement and just measured mattering, the experience of mattering. And because the idea was is that employee engagement is the lagging indicator of three states, as you know: psychological meaningfulness, psychological safety, psychological availability, which are, again, mattering in disguise. And we started measuring mattering, and then all leaders were trained on those behaviors, and their teams were evaluated on how frequently their leaders did the behaviors they committed to.
Mm.
They saw a 50% reduction in attrition in 8 months.
Wow. In 8 months. Oh my God.
8 months voluntary leaving. And engagement scores went up. They were finally able to make a dent on engagement scores. And one of the people who were part of the process didn't necessarily say it was anything special, but she said it gave us all permission to be human again. So that's an example, and they called it our mattering blueprint. That's an example of an environment making the behavior possible, determining that it will occur, right? Taking
Mm.
it seriously. Another great case study is Barry Waymiller and Bob Chapman, who wrote the book Everybody Matters. They have a leadership checklist. And if you look at their checklist, it's a daily checklist, you'll see that almost all of it revolves around ensuring the person in the next interaction they have feels valued and knows how they add value.
Mm. Zach, can you have too much mattering? I'm conscious.
Well,
I'm conscious of
so
right, like this idea, this like
yeah,
it's very
dark side. I know you
Aristotelian.
like the dark side.
Well, but it's like beyond the dark side. It's like it's an Aristotelian question, right? This idea of like the golden mean, right? Like that virtue always exists between two vices. And I'll just kind of I'll qualify this question because I've been thinking about it myself. I've got a volunteer gig that I'm involved with that is probably the place where I feel like I matter the most in my professional identity. It is a place where I feel so valued and I feel so valuable, and it makes me feel great. I love it. And what I notice is that I move in the direction of the places where I feel like I matter, and sometimes I move so much so that I see this volunteer job creeping and overtaking other important goals that I have in my life. And it's made me wonder, is mattering a little bit like a drug? Like is there a narcotic element of mattering that if you're not careful about how it's positioned, it can potentially inhibit boundaries that might kind of draw you away from other important goals that you might have in your life. It's just a pondering I'm curious about.
This is a good pondering. There is such a thing as the excessive need to matter.
Hmm.
Okay, so the excessive need to matter is usually the result of childhood attachment issues. When we look at the research on mattering, and when I don't feel like I matter as a child, I have this excessive need to validate myself. And that's
Hmm.
problematic because in 1.5% of the population, that can morph into clinical narcissism. Like narcissism, for example, is one result of the perpetual unmet need to matter in someone's life.
Ugh, wow, great.
So, yes, there can be this excessive need to matter that results in destructive behaviors, or what you're talking about is one of the things to be careful of is not confusing mattering with codependence.
Hmm.
So a codependent relationship is one in which that I put your needs because I feel like I matter to you so much above my own needs.
Hmm.
So the need to matter to you eclipses my own well-being needs. Now,
Hmm.
this could happen. This could happen to a nurse, for example, in a toxic work environment, that her job matters and her patients matter so much, and she matters to them so much that she's willing to suffer to serve. That's an example of codependence. That's where mattering has a dark side.
Hmm.
It can also have a dark side when that volunteer organization manipulates you because your job and it makes you feel like you matter. Like, I know this makes Andrew feel like he matters, so I'm going to ask him to work overtime or ask him for more.
Hmm.
So anytime, I think a good test of this as a leader to make sure you're not manipulating it is anytime you see the person and their sense of mattering as a means to your end, you're ceasing to pursue mattering and you're starting to pursue manipulation.
Hmm.
So yes, there can be an excessive need to matter. The mattering can be manipulated, just like all good, inherently positive psychological concepts on their surface. And then yes, we can have the excessive need to matter. But there's also a difference. I just want to make a quick note, we've been talking about interpersonal mattering. There is a difference between interpersonal mattering, societal mattering, and existential mattering.
Mm,
My focus is really on interpersonal mattering, so experiencing significance to the person across from you. But in some ways, I think you also may be talking about, does my life matter? Which that the pursuit of that can be overdone to the probably
mhm,
detriment of seeing how you matter interpersonally and doing it for others.
mhm,
Or this idea of existential mattering. Some people say to me, Zach, well, I have this deity that
mhm,
created me, so I inherently matter.
mhm,
So I don't have to worry about any of this earthly stuff.
mm,
But that's why I say, well, what we're talking about is terrestrial mattering, which is mattering to other people, which
mm.
has,
Isaac.
which really has the most significant impact on a lot of the well-being measures that we see when it comes
Mhm.
to mattering is interpersonal mattering.
Isaac Pilantensky, who is the person that we named right at the very beginning of this podcast, he talks about kind of me versus we cultures. And
Yeah,
there
yeah.
is, there's a we version of mattering, and there's an I or a me version of mattering. And
Yeah, yes.
it strikes me that the we is probably the one that we want to aim for.
Right. And the I taken to its end probably leads to narcissistic tendencies.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like, let's see how much I matter. But we have to remember also that one of the things that's often undiscussed, it's often like how to deal with narcissists, is what creates narcissism, which is again these attachment issues as children, and then the perpetual unmet need to matter over the course of a lifespan. So as we look at things like education, raising children, people's first jobs, you can actually become complicit in creating the behaviors you say you don't want by not creating mattering for people.
Hmm. Yes. Oh, that's a provocation. Certainly for me to be able to consider as I go back and reflect on my life and my attachment styles as a child.
Well, yeah, I'm
But
not getting into that because I'm not a clinical psychologist. Like, let's just put that out there. I'm not a clinical psychologist. But when you study mattering, actually, it's just good for listeners. I mean, the Gordon Flett's book, The Psychology of Mattering, I encourage you to check that out because
Mm,
it gives a really good depiction of how a lot of the mattering work that's modernized now has come out of really attachment theory
mm,
and has a very close connection to attachment theory. It's one of our earliest expressions of mattering is how we
mm.
attach as
And matter
children.
and mattering matters so much because it is fundamentally a psychological need. And I guess that's the point. Like
Yeah.
we're talking
Yeah.
about something
Right.
that's core to human beings,
Four.
core to every single individual. Zach, is there anything that you think I should have asked you today about mattering or meaningful work before we wrap up?
Yeah, well, it's probably weird for people to listen to me and know that I wrote about purpose. I used to write about purpose a lot. I did my dissertation and research around meaningful work, and now I'm talking about mattering.
What's the
So
shift for you? Well, yeah.
what are the difference between these things,
Totally.
right?
Yeah.
And one of the things is that I see, as you know, meaningfulness is the broader sense that we and what we're doing are positive, purposeful, and significant. It's the sense we make of something that's significant, whereas meaning is just the sense we make of something.
Hmm.
So meaningfulness is that sense. Mattering is the interpersonal experience of feeling significant, which is an input to meaningfulness. Purpose is this sense of directedness, and I like the sense of directedness that is useful to others. That also contributes to making sense of things as positive and purposeful, which is
Hmm.
meaningfulness. But the reason that shifted for me is that I didn't have a word for what I noticed with those janitors, right? It was they experienced their work as meaningful, but they relied on interpersonal experiences of mattering. And I think that is a good way to think about how these words relate. And I was also thinking, someone raised me, Zach, how can I find my purpose if I don't believe that I'm worthy? And that was a provocation for me because I'm like, wow, just like mattering comes first when we're born, it seems like mattering has to come first before we pursue all of these other things.
Zach, thank you so much for your stories, for your pragmatic suggestions, for the ways you've taken something that is remarkably complex, remarkably foundational to what it means to be human, and also translated that wisdom into really simple things that all of us can do, where there's very little barriers to doing it and to being able to do it other than our will to try. Thank you. Thank you for elucidating us about mattering today.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.